The old house groaned under the weight of the wind. Rain lashed against the windows, each gust a mournful cry. Inside, Amy fidgeted on the worn sofa, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls.
I feel like I'm being watched, but I'm alone.
A faint creak echoed from the hallway, causing her to tense. She tried to dismiss it as the house settling, an old house's natural sounds on a stormy night, but the feeling of disquiet persisted.
It's just the wind, just the wind.
Amy wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the sudden chill that permeated the air. Driven by a thirst she couldn't ignore, Amy moved towards the kitchen. Each step felt heavy, as if she were wading through thick air. The kitchen, usually a comforting space, now felt cold and alien.
Just get a glass of water, Amy. Nothing to be afraid of.
As she reached for a glass, Amy heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a slow, deliberate intake of breath close to her ear. She froze, her hand hovering over the glass.
Who's there?
Amy slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the kitchen. Amy quickly left the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, urging her to move faster. The hallway seemed longer and darker than before. Each step she took echoed ominously, amplifying her growing sense of dread. The shadows danced and shifted, playing tricks on her eyes. They seemed almost alive, as if they were watching her every move. As she reached the hallway's end, a door creaked open slowly, revealing the darkness of the spare bedroom. The sound was almost deafening in the silence.
What is happening? She whispered, her voice trembling.
A whisper, soft and chilling, seemed to emanate from the open doorway. It was barely audible, yet it sent shivers down her spine. Amy couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent a wave of icy fear down her spine. Her breath quickened, and she felt a cold sweat forming on her forehead. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the open door, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was experiencing. The fear was almost paralyzing.
"Amy!" the voice called, barely more than a breath.
The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent, a breath against her ear. She could almost feel the presence behind her. Terror gripped her, paralyzing her with fear. She knew she had to move, but her body refused to obey. Amy retreated back to the living room, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She couldn't believe what she had just seen.
She fumbled for her phone, desperate to call for help, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor.
The screen flickered erratically, displaying strange symbols before going completely black. The room was now plunged into an eerie silence. Panic surged through her as she realized she was completely alone and cut off from the outside world. The walls seemed to close in on her. As she turned away from the dead phone, she saw it, a shadow that shouldn't be there.
A dark figure stood in the corner of the living room, its form barely visible in the dim light. It seemed to absorb the light around it.
It was tall and imposing, its presence radiating an aura of menace. The air grew colder, and Amy could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Amy's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with terror. She felt paralyzed, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. The figure moved slowly towards her, its movements fluid and unnatural. Each step it took seemed to echo in the silence.
Amy stumbled backward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The terror was overwhelming, consuming her every thought and action.
Suddenly, a loud banging on the front door shattered the terrifying tableau. Amy's eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. The dark figure that had been haunting her thoughts vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Relief flooded through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the door, hoping it was help, her mind racing with possibilities of who could be there.
"Amy, are you okay? I saw your lights flickering and got worried," she exclaimed, rushing inside with a look of deep concern.
It was Lucy, her friend, her face pale and etched with worry, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. Amy embraced her friend, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline, feeling a momentary sense of safety in her presence. But as Lucy stepped into the house, her shadow stretched across the floor, distorting into something long and unnatural, sending a chill down Amy's spine. Amy pulled back slightly, a flicker of unease returning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Lucy's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a little too sharp, a little too pointed.
Of course I am, she replied, her voice a little too sweet, a little too high-pitched.
Amy's unease intensified. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if trying to warn her. Amy looked around the room, the shadows seeming to deepen, to shift and swirl.
Lucy's hand tightened on Amy's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't worry," she said.